Yoo Ji-hoon's mansion was a testament to success, an architectural marvel perched on the edge of Seoul's most elite neighborhood. But inside, the air was cold and heavy, as if the walls bore the weight of their owner's unspoken grief. Ji-hoon stood by the massive window in his study, his sharp features softened by the pale light of the rain-soaked afternoon. His tailored suit clung to his broad shoulders, but his eyes, tired, dark, and far away, hinted at a man who had spent years running from ghosts. The rhythmic tapping of raindrops on the glass was the only sound, a metronome to his solitude. "Sir, she's here," came the voice of his assistant over the intercom. Ji-hoon didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to the garden below, where his daughter, Yoonbi, sat alone under the gazebo, tracing patterns on the wet table with her finger. She hadn't smiled since her mother's funeral. She barely spoke. A pang of helplessness twisted in his chest. But Yoo Ji-hoon was not a man who dwelled on emotions for long. "Send her in," he said curtly, adjusting his tie out of habit. In the foyer, Kang Aryam hesitated before stepping forward. Her brown leather satchel, slightly scuffed at the edges, hung at her side, a contrast to the immaculate surroundings. Aryam's delicate face was framed by loose strands of jet-black hair, hastily tucked behind her ears. She had dressed carefully for this meeting, a simple navy blouse and a modest skirt, but the grandeur of the mansion made her feel like a misplaced note in a symphony. She glanced at the towering staircase and the elegant chandelier above, her heart thumping in rhythm with the distant sound of piano notes. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the strap of her bag. "Miss Kang?" The butler's voice startled her. "Yes, I'm sorry," she said, bowing politely before following him to the study. The room smelled faintly of leather and cedarwood, and Aryam's gaze flitted over the towering bookshelves and the grand piano tucked into a corner. Ji-hoon was seated behind an imposing desk, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. He gestured to the chair opposite him without a word. "Thank you for considering me for this position," Aryam began, her voice steady despite her nerves. Ji-hoon raised an eyebrow. "Your credentials are unconventional." The remark stung, but Aryam maintained her composure. "I've been teaching piano for several years. I've worked with children from various backgrounds, and my daughter is not just any child," Ji-hoon interrupted, his tone clipped. "She hasn't touched the piano since her mother passed away. If you think this is just another job, you're mistaken." Aryam swallowed her retort. This man, she realized, was a fortress, every word a stone laid to protect whatever lay behind his walls. But instead of feeling intimidated, she felt a flicker of determination. "I understand," she said, meeting his gaze. "Music has a way of healing wounds that words cannot. I would like to help her find that again." For a moment, Ji-hoon said nothing. Then, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing her sincerity. Before he could respond, the door creaked open, and Eunbi stepped in. The little girl's eyes, large and shadowed with sadness, darted between her father and Aryam. She clutched a small notebook to her chest, her posture hesitant. Ji-hoon's stern expression softened imperceptibly. "This is Miss Kang," Ji-hoon said, his voice gentler. "She'll be teaching you piano." Yoonbi's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced at Aryam briefly before looking away, her silence heavy. "Hello, Yoonbi," Aryam said with a warm smile. "I'm excited to meet you. Do you have a favorite song you like to play?" Yoonbi shook her head, her grip on the notebook tightening. "She doesn't talk much," Ji-hoon explained, the edges of his voice laced with frustration. Aryam knelt slightly to meet Yoonbi's eye level. "That's okay," she said softly. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. Maybe the piano can speak for you instead." The words hung in the air like a melody waiting for its resolution. Ji-hoon watched, his jaw tightening as he suppressed the instinct to dismiss the moment. For the first time, Aryam's presence seemed to shift something imperceptible in the room. Yunbi stepped back and left the room without a word, but not before glancing at Aryam one last time. "She's shy," Aryam said gently as the door clicked shut. "She's grieving," Jihoon corrected, his tone sharp. "If you're not up to the task." "I am," Aryam said firmly. Jihoon studied her, his dark eyes probing for any sign of doubt. "We'll see," he said finally, rising to his feet. "The first lesson is tomorrow. Don't be late." As Aryam exited the mansion, the rain had stopped, leaving the world outside glistening under a pale sun. She paused at the gates, her chest tightening with a mix of apprehension and resolve. Somewhere deep within the walls of that house, a lonely man and his grieving daughter needed her. And maybe, just maybe, she needed them too. The sunlight poured softly into the music room the next day, its golden rays dancing across the polished surface of the grand piano. Kang Aryam arrived early, her heart racing with a mix of anticipation and nerves. She adjusted the music sheets she had brought, smoothing out their edges as if arranging them perfectly would calm the storm within her. She took in the details of the room once again. The towering bookshelves, the cool marble flooring, the faint smell of cedarwood. The grandeur was undeniable, but there was an emptiness here, as though the room waited for something, or someone, to fill its silence. The door creaked open, and Yunbi stepped inside, her small figure illuminated by the morning light. She wore a pale blue dress, and her steps were hesitant as she approached the piano. Her large, somber eyes locked briefly with Aryam's before darting away. "Good morning, Yunbi," Aryam said with a gentle smile. "I hope you slept well." Yunbi nodded faintly, clutching a small notebook to her chest. "Shall we start with something simple today?" Aryam continued, sensing the girl's reluctance. "I thought we could play a duet. I'll handle the harder parts, and you can just follow along." Yunbi blinked at her, uncertain, but eventually slid onto the piano bench. Aryam sat beside her, giving her space, and began to play a soft melody. The first notes filled the room like a whisper, gentle and inviting. Yunbi hesitated before pressing a single key, her touch timid but precise. As their notes mingled, a curious warmth spread through the room. Aryam glanced at Yunbi, noticing the way her tiny hands hovered uncertainly over the keys, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You're doing great," Aryam said softly, her voice like a breeze that carried away the tension. For a moment, Yunbi's lips twitched, as if she might smile, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. Jihoon, standing silently in the doorway, watched the scene unfold. His sharp features softened slightly as his gaze lingered on Yunbi. He remembered the last time the piano had filled their home with music. His late wife used to play on quiet evenings, Yunbi curled up beside her. The ache of that memory resurfaced, but there was something different now, something almost hopeful. "She hasn't touched the piano since her mother died," Jihoon said, his deep voice startling Aryam. Yunbi flinched slightly, pulling her hands away from the keys, but Aryam placed a reassuring hand near hers. "It's okay," she said softly. "You don't have to play if you don't want to. Music will wait for you. It always does." Jihoon's gaze hardened momentarily. "What are you trying to do?" Aryam turned to face him, her expression calm but resolute. "I'm trying to show her that it's okay to feel again." Jihoon folded his arms, his jaw tightening. He wasn't sure whether to admire her determination or dismiss it as naive. "And what makes you think you're qualified to teach her that?" "I've been there," Aryam replied simply, meeting his piercing gaze. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Jihoon noticed something deeper in her eyes, a shadow of her own struggles, hidden beneath her calm exterior. That evening, as Aryam walked home, her thoughts lingered on Jihoon's words. The intensity in his voice wasn't just protectiveness, it was pain. She wondered how much of himself he had buried beneath his cold, composed demeanor. When she reached her modest apartment, Aryam set her bag down and pulled out an old photograph from a drawer. It was a picture of her younger self, standing beside a grand piano at a music competition. Her smile was radiant, filled with the unshakable dreams of a teenager. That was before everything changed. Her father's illness, the mounting hospital bills, the quiet resignation of knowing that her dreams had to take a back seat to survival. Aryam sighed, placing the photo back in its drawer. Tomorrow, she thought, she would return to that house filled with shadows and try again. If she could bring even a sliver of light into Yunbi's life, or Jihoon's, it would be worth it. The music room, bathed in the soft hues of early morning sunlight, felt warmer that day, though neither Jihoon nor Yunbi would have noticed the subtle change. Kang Aryam, however, did. As she stepped inside, her eyes instinctively went to the grand piano. It wasn't just an instrument, it was a portal. It had been her salvation once, and now she hoped it could be Yunbi's too. Yunbi entered moments later, her small figure framed by the door. Her long black hair was tied back neatly, accentuating her delicate features. She hesitated before approaching the piano, clutching the notebook that never seemed to leave her side. "Good morning, Yunbi," Aryam greeted, her tone bright but soft enough not to overwhelm. Yunbi didn't respond, but Aryam caught the faintest flicker of acknowledgement in her dark eyes. It was a start. "How about we try something new today?" Aryam asked, arranging a simple piece on the piano stand. "This one's called Twinkling Lights. It's easy, but it sounds magical when played just right." Aryam began playing the opening notes, her fingers gliding effortlessly over the keys. The melody was light and playful, like tiny stars dancing in a quiet night sky. She stopped and gestured to Yunbi to join her. Yunbi hesitated, her hands hovering above the keys. For a moment, the room was filled with silence, save for the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. "It's okay," Aryam encouraged gently. "There's no wrong way to start." Tentatively, Yunbi pressed a single key. The soft tone resonated, fragile yet clear. Aryam smiled, her own fingers joining to weave the next part of the melody. Slowly, Yunbi began to follow, her small hands finding their rhythm. From the hallway, Jihoon stood watching. His usual guarded expression faltered as he leaned against the doorframe, unnoticed. The simple notes his daughter played weren't perfect, but they carried something he hadn't heard in months, a faint echo of joy. The session continued, with Yunbi growing more confident as the minutes passed. Occasionally, her gaze flickered toward Aryam, who offered constant reassurance through her expressions and subtle nods. "You're doing beautifully," Aryam whispered as they finished the piece together. For the briefest moment, Yunbi's lips curved into a shy smile. It was fleeting, but Aryam saw it. Her chest swelled with a quiet pride. Jihoon, however, was less at ease. Later that evening, as he sat in his study, his thoughts lingered on the scene. He'd watched Yunbi smile like a man who'd stumbled upon a fragile treasure, but the question that haunted him was whether this newfound light could last, or whether it was destined to fade, just as so many things in his life had before. The days fell into a quiet rhythm, and with each lesson, the once cold music room began to transform. Warmth seeped into its corners, carried by the soft hum of melodies and the hesitant laughter of Yunbi as she grew more comfortable at the piano. Kang Aryam arrived earlier than usual that morning, her satchel swinging lightly at her side. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked on her way, daisies and sprigs of lavender. Placing them in a modest vase near the piano, she stepped back and smiled. The flowers added a simple, cheerful touch to the otherwise pristine room. Yunbi entered shortly after, her steps less timid than before. Her eyes flicked to the flowers, lingering for a moment before she glanced at Aryam. "Good morning, Yunbi," Aryam greeted with her usual warmth. "Do you like them? I thought the room could use a little color." Yunbi nodded, her lips curving into the faintest smile before she settled onto the piano bench. The lesson began with a new piece, one that challenged Yunbi to use both hands simultaneously. At first, she struggled, her notes clashing awkwardly. Frustration clouded her delicate features, her fingers hesitating above the keys. "Let's take it slow," Ariam suggested, her voice soothing. She moved beside Yunbi and demonstrated the left-hand part with deliberate care. "It's like walking in the rain, step by step, one foot in front of the other." Yunbi tried again, her movements measured. Slowly, the dissonance faded, replaced by a hesitant harmony. The melody began to flow, and for the first time, she played the piece from start to finish. "Beautiful," Ariam exclaimed softly, clapping her hands. From his place in the hallway, Jihoon watched, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't step into the room, but his gaze lingered on Ariam as she praised Yunbi. There was something disarming about her. A quiet persistence. A refusal to give up on anyone, least of all his daughter. That afternoon, after the lesson, Jihoon found Ariam in the garden, where she was sitting on a low bench under a cherry blossom tree. She had a book in her hands, though she wasn't reading. The sunlight caught the strands of her dark hair, framing her face in a soft glow. "You've made progress with Yunbi," Jihoon said, his deep voice breaking the silence. Ariam looked up, surprised to see him outside the walls of his study. She stood, brushing off her skirt. "She's very talented. She just needed someone to remind her of that." Jihoon tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Why do you care so much?" The question hung in the air, but Ariam didn't falter. "Because I know what it's like to feel invisible. Music gave me a voice when I couldn't find the words. Maybe it can do the same for her." Jihoon's expression didn't change, but his silence felt less cold. After a moment, he nodded. "The flowers suit the room," he said, before walking away. The days continued to pass, and with them came small, significant changes. Yunbi began to arrive in the music room before Ariam, her notebook filled with scribbled notes and drawings of musical staffs. Jihoon started appearing during lessons, seated silently in the corner. His presence was quiet but felt, like the steady weight of a watchful guardian. One day, Yunbi surprised Ariam with a question. "Can you teach me the song you played last week? The one with the twinkling sounds?" Ariam blinked, momentarily stunned by the rare display of initiative. "Of course," she said, her heart swelling with pride. As Yunbi played, Jihoon allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. But the closer they grew, the more Jihoon felt a quiet unease creeping in. He wasn't sure if it was the fear of losing the fragile progress Yunbi had made, or the way Ariam's presence seemed to reach places he'd long since buried. The evening gala was everything Jihoon despised, lavish, loud, and rife with pretense. But as CEO of his company, his presence was non-negotiable. The ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers and golden decor, while a string quartet played softly in the background. Jihoon stood near the edge of the crowd, a glass of champagne untouched in his hand, scanning the room with his usual detached demeanor. Kang Arayam, however, was an unexpected addition to the event. She had come as a guest of a former colleague who insisted the gala was a networking opportunity she couldn't miss. Dressed in an elegant but simple lavender gown, her hair swept into a loose chignon, Arayam exuded a quiet grace that stood out in the sea of ostentation. Jihoon noticed her before she saw him. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to observe her. She seemed out of place, yet unbothered by it, her eyes curiously scanning the room, as though trying to absorb the unfamiliar grandeur. Their eyes met across the crowd. Jihoon's expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of surprise, as if he hadn't expected to see her outside the familiar confines of his home. Ariam offered a polite smile, her heart skipping a beat as she approached him. "Mr. Yu," she greeted, bowing slightly. "I didn't expect to see you here." "This is my territory," he replied dryly, gesturing to the room. "What brings you to a place like this?" Before she could answer, another voice cut in, a sharp, familiar tone. "Oh, Aryam, I didn't think I'd see you here." Aryam turned to find Oh Hyejin, her former university peer, and now a celebrated concert pianist. Hyejin's crimson gown clung to her figure, and her smile carried an edge of condescension. "You're still teaching, I see," Hyejin continued, her tone dripping with false concern. "It's admirable, really, sticking to something so modest." Jihoon's eyes narrowed slightly as he observed the interaction. Aryam straightened, refusing to let Hyejin's words rattle her. "Teaching has its own rewards," Aryam replied calmly. "Not everything is about recognition." Hyejin laughed lightly, a sound as polished as the rest of her facade. "Of course, but I imagine it must be difficult, especially when you used to dream so big. It's a shame." Jihoon stepped closer, his imposing presence casting a shadow over the conversation. "Miss Kang's work has been instrumental in helping my daughter," he said, his voice low but firm. "And unlike many here, she doesn't need a stage to prove her worth." Hyejin faltered, her confidence wavering under Jihoon's piercing gaze. She excused herself quickly, leaving Aryam stunned. "You didn't have to do that," Aryam said quietly, once they were alone. "I don't tolerate arrogance," Jihoon replied, his tone clipped. "Especially toward people who don't deserve it." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Aryam avoided Hyejin's gaze and busied herself with casual conversations, but Jihoon's words stayed with her. His defense of her had been unexpected, and it stirred something unfamiliar, a sense of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. The next morning, Jihoon found Aryam in the garden, sitting under the cherry blossom tree. Her lavender dress from the night before had been replaced by a simple blouse and jeans, but her thoughtful expression remained. "You handled yourself well last night," Jihoon said, approaching her. "Did I?" she asked, tilting her head to meet his gaze. "It didn't feel like it." Jihoon hesitated. Hyejin's comments, were they true? Aryam looked away, her fingers brushing the petals scattered on the bench. "I had opportunities, big ones, but life doesn't always go the way we plan." Her voice was steady, but there was a weight to her words that Jihoon recognized all too well. "Why didn't you fight for it?" he asked, his tone softer than usual. Aryam turned back to him, her eyes shining with quiet resolve. "Sometimes fighting means letting go. My family needed me more than the world needed another pianist." For a moment, Jihoon didn't know what to say. Her words echoed his own unspoken regrets. Choices made, sacrifices endured. Later that day, Aryam arrived for Yunbi's lesson with a renewed sense of purpose. But as she entered the music room, she noticed something different. Yunbi was already seated at the piano, her small hands playing a melody Aryam recognized instantly. It was the piece Aryam had played during her university days, a composition she had thought forgotten. "Where did you learn this?" Aryam asked, her voice catching in her throat. Yunbi didn't answer immediately. She glanced at her father, who stood silently in the corner. "Appa found it," Yunbi said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said it was yours." Aryam turned to Jihoon, her chest tightening. "You kept this?" Jihoon's gaze was steady. "I thought it might mean something to you." For the first time, Aryam felt the barriers between them begin to crack. The soft strains of Yunbi's hesitant melody filled the music room, weaving through the silence like a delicate thread. Kang Aryam stood by the piano, her hands trembling slightly as she watched the young girl play the piece she had composed years ago. The music carried her back to a time when she had been a starry-eyed student, practicing late into the night in the dimly lit halls of her university. It was a piece she had poured her heart into, one that encapsulated her dreams and fears. Hearing it again now, played by Unbi's small hands, stirred a whirlwind of emotions. "Why didn't you tell me you had this?" Auriam asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yoo Ji-hoon, standing in his usual place by the door, met her gaze. "I didn't know if it mattered anymore." "It matters," Auriam said, her tone firm. Her fingers brushed against the edges of the music sheet on the piano. This was everything I was before my life changed." Ji-hoon studied her, his dark eyes searching for something in her expression. He took a step closer, his voice lower, almost hesitant. "Why did you stop? You had so much talent." "I had responsibilities," Auriam interrupted, a flicker of frustration flashing in her eyes. "My father was sick. My family needed me more than I needed a stage. Sometimes dreams have to wait." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken regrets and shared pain. Ji-hoon's jaw tightened as he glanced at Yoonbi, who had stopped playing and was now watching them quietly, her wide eyes flicking between the two adults. Yoonbi hesitated before speaking, her voice soft. "Miss Kang, do you miss it? Playing for big audiences?" Auriam knelt beside the little girl, her smile gentle but tinged with sadness. "Sometimes. But teaching you has reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. It's not about the audience. It's about the joy of sharing something beautiful." Yoonbi's lips curved into a small smile, but the moment was interrupted by the sharp ring of Ji-hoon's phone. He frowned at the screen before excusing himself from the room. As Ji-hoon walked into his study, his thoughts were a jumble of conflicted emotions. Auriam's words lingered in his mind, her resolve to prioritize her family over her dreams striking a chord he didn't want to acknowledge. Seo Min-seok's voice on the other end of the line broke his reverie. "You've been avoiding the board's questions, Ji-hoon. They're pressing for answers about the Han deal." "I'll handle it," Ji-hoon replied curtly. "And Eunbi?" Min-seok asked, his tone softening. "How is she?" Ji-hoon paused, his eyes drifting to the window overlooking the garden. "She's better. Auriam is helping her." "Auriam, huh?" There was a hint of curiosity in Min-seok's voice. "She's making an impression, isn't she?" Ji-hoon didn't respond immediately, his mind flashing to the way Auriam had defended herself against Hye-jin, how her eyes lit up when she talked about music, how Yoonbi seemed to glow in her presence. "It's not like that," Ji-hoon said finally, though his own voice lacked conviction. The next day, Auriam arrived for her lesson, only to find Ji-hoon waiting for her in the garden. His usual suit was replaced with a more casual look, rolled-up sleeves and no tie, and for the first time, he seemed approachable. "I wanted to talk to you," Ji-hoon began, gesturing for her to sit beside him on the bench under the cherry blossom tree. Auriam hesitated before taking a seat, her heart beating faster than she'd like to admit. "Is something wrong?" "No," Ji-hoon said, his voice unusually gentle. I wanted to thank you. For Eunbi. For everything." She looked at him, surprised. "You don't have to thank me. She's a wonderful girl." "She is," Ji-hoon agreed, his gaze softening. "But she wasn't like this before you came. You've given her something I couldn't. Hope." Auriam felt a lump rise in her throat. Before she could respond, Ji-hoon added, "I also wanted to apologize for questioning your ability, for doubting you. That was unfair." Auriam shook her head. "You were protecting Yoonbi. I understand." The moment hung between them, fragile and filled with unspoken emotions. Ji-hoon's hand twitched, as if he wanted to reach for hers, but he stopped himself. Instead, he rose abruptly, clearing his throat. "I should let you get to the lesson," he said, his usual composed mask slipping back into place. Auriam watched him go, her chest tightening with something she couldn't quite name. That evening, as Aryam sat alone in her small apartment, she opened the drawer where she kept her old photograph. This time, she didn't close it immediately. Instead, she picked up the picture, studying the bright-eyed girl she used to be. Maybe it's not too late, she murmured to herself, her fingers tracing the edges of the photo. But even as she said the words, doubts crept in. Was it possible to reclaim a part of herself without risking everything she had now? The faint melody of her own composition played in her mind, a reminder of the woman she once was, and the woman she was becoming again. The piano recital hall brimmed with quiet anticipation. The soft murmur of conversations and the faint rustle of programs being adjusted echoed through the room. A warm spotlight illuminated the glossy surface of the grand piano on stage, the instrument waiting silently for its next performer. In the audience, Kang Aryam sat beside Yoo Ji-hoon and Yoonbi, her heart beating as though she were the one about to perform. Yoonbi clutched her father's hand tightly, her other hand holding Aryam's. "Are you nervous?" Aryam asked gently, leaning closer to the little girl. Yoonbi nodded, her wide eyes reflecting both excitement and trepidation. "What if I mess up?" "Then we'll smile and try again," Aryam said, her voice warm with reassurance. "Mistakes are just part of the music." Ji-hoon's gaze shifted to Aryam, his expression unreadable. Her ability to ease Yoonbi's fears with such simple yet profound words stirred something inside him. Admiration, gratitude, and a flicker of something more. The announcement for Eunbi's turn came, and she rose slowly, her small figure dwarfed by the grandeur of the stage. The room fell into a hushed silence as she took her place at the piano, her fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the keys. The first note rang out, a hesitant, soft sound that hung in the air like the opening of a story. Yoonbi's eyes flicked to the audience where Aryam smiled encouragingly. That silent support gave Yoonbi the courage to continue. Her melody began to flow, gaining strength and confidence with each passing moment. The hall was filled with the delicate, dreamlike notes of her piece, a tune that spoke of longing and quiet resilience. Ji-hoon leaned forward in his seat, his usually composed demeanor faltering as he watched his daughter, her small hands commanding the grand piano with growing certainty. When Eunbi finished, the applause was immediate and thunderous. Aryam clapped enthusiastically, pride lighting up her face, while Ji-hoon's eyes shimmered with a rare emotion, unfiltered joy. Backstage, Yoonbi ran into Aryam's arms, her face glowing with triumph. "You were amazing!" Aryam exclaimed, lifting the girl slightly off the ground. "I'm so proud of you." Ji-hoon stood nearby, his hands in his pockets, a soft smile tugging at his lips as he watched the scene. "Appa," Yoonbi said, turning to him. "Did I do okay?" "You did more than okay," Ji-hoon said, crouching to her level. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the depth of his pride. "You were perfect." Yoonbi threw her arms around him, and for a moment, the three of them stood together, an unspoken bond weaving them closer. Later that evening, Ji-hoon invited Aryam to join them for dinner. The small family-style restaurant he chose was a stark contrast to his usual fine dining preferences, but it felt right. Yoonbi chattered happily between bites of food, her joy infectious. Aryam laughed softly at one of Yoonbi's stories, and Ji-hoon found himself captivated by the sound. Her laughter was unguarded and genuine, a reminder of the warmth he had been missing for so long. As Yoonbi excused herself to the restroom, Ji-hoon turned to Aryam. "Thank you," he said, his voice lower, more intimate. "For what?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "For giving my daughter something I couldn't," he admitted, his gaze holding hers. "For making her believe in herself again." Aryam hesitated, her cheeks warming under his intense gaze. "You've done more for her than you realize. She's your daughter. Her strength comes from you." Ji-hoon smiled faintly, the edges of his usual stoicism softening. "And you." he said quietly. The words lingered between them, unspoken feelings hanging in the air. But before either could say more, Yoonbi returned, bringing the conversation back to lighter topics. Later that night, Aryam stood on the balcony of her apartment, staring at the city lights that stretched endlessly before her. The events of the day replayed in her mind: the music, Yoonbi's triumph, and Jihoon's words. A part of her wanted to believe there was something growing between them, but another part warned her to tread carefully. Jihoon was a man of walls and shadows, and she wasn't sure if she could, or should, step into his world completely. In his own home, Jihoon poured himself a glass of whiskey, sitting in the quiet of his study. His thoughts drifted to Aryam, her unwavering kindness, her ability to bring light into the darkest corners of his life. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility of letting someone in. But the weight of his past lingered like a shadow, whispering doubts he couldn't quite silence. The recital had left an undeniable warmth in its wake. Yoonbi was more vibrant, her once reticent nature giving way to tentative confidence. Yet for both Jihoon and Aryam, the aftermath of that night brought a cascade of emotions that were harder to sort through. The following day, the music room was quiet, the only sound the occasional rustle of paper, as Aryam arranged the sheet music for Yoonbi's next lesson. Jihoon had excused himself from the lesson, citing a business meeting, though Aryam suspected his absence was intentional. Yoonbi entered, her steps lighter than usual. She smiled at Aryam, an expression that had grown more frequent, but still felt precious. "Can we play the duet today?" Yoonbi asked, her voice soft but eager. "Of course," Aryam replied, her own mood lifting at the child's enthusiasm. The melody began, their notes blending seamlessly, and for a moment, Aryam forgot her lingering uncertainties. But as Eunbi played with newfound confidence, Aryam couldn't ignore the ache growing in her chest. She had become attached, not just to Eunbi, but to the life they were building together, even if it wasn't truly hers. That evening, Aryam found herself on a quiet park bench, her fingers clutching a letter she had written weeks ago. It was a resignation letter, unfinished, but the words on the page weighed heavily on her. She stared at the letter, her mind torn. Staying meant risking her heart, exposing herself to a connection that might crumble under the weight of Jihoon's grief and his tightly guarded world. But leaving meant abandoning Yoonbi, who had begun to trust her in ways Aryam knew she didn't with anyone else. "Is it the letter that's troubling you, or what it represents?" The voice startled her. She looked up to see Jihoon standing a few steps away, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. The soft glow of the park's lampposts lit his sharp features, but his expression was unreadable. "How did you—" Aryam began but trailed off, realizing she hadn't told anyone about the letter. "Yoonbi found it," Jihoon explained, his voice calm but firm. "She didn't read it, but she brought it to me, worried it meant you were leaving." Aryam's chest tightened. "I didn't want to upset her," she said softly. I don't know if staying is the right choice." Jihoon sat beside her, the distance between them small but charged. "And why is that?" Aryam hesitated, her gaze dropping to the letter in her lap. "Because I'm afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that this, whatever this is, will hurt more in the end than if I leave now." Jihoon was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the ground. Then he spoke, his voice low and reflective. "I know what it's like to be afraid of letting someone in. After my wife, I told myself it was easier to keep people at a distance. Safer." He turned to her, his gaze piercing but vulnerable. "But watching you with Yoonbi, it's made me realize that sometimes keeping people out doesn't protect you. It just leaves you empty." Aryam felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She didn't speak, afraid her voice would betray the tumult of emotions swirling inside her. Jihoon reached for her hand, his touch tentative, as if seeking permission. "Stay," he said simply. For Yunbi. For yourself. For us. The words were soft yet powerful, and they hung in the air like a melody waiting for resolution. The next morning, Yunbi ran to the music room, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. She greeted Aryam with a beaming smile, her joy contagious. Miss Kang, Yunbi said excitedly, I made this for you. She opened the notebook to reveal a series of drawings, simple but heartfelt depictions of Aryam at the piano, teaching Yunbi, laughing with Jihoon. At the bottom of the page was a single sentence written in uneven handwriting. Thank you for bringing music back to our home. Aryam felt her throat tighten as she looked at the drawings. She knelt to Eunbi's level, pulling her into a gentle hug. Thank you, Eunbi. This means so much to me. From the doorway, Jihoon watched the scene unfold, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Later that day, Aryam found herself in Jihoon's study, the resignation letter still in her bag but far from her thoughts. Jihoon stood by the window, his usual stoic demeanor softened. I didn't mean to pressure you last night, he said without turning around. I just didn't want to lose what we've started. Aryam stepped closer, her voice steady. You didn't pressure me. You were honest, and I needed to hear it. When Jihoon finally turned to face her, his expression was a mixture of relief and something deeper, something Aryam wasn't ready to name, but felt mirrored in herself. They stood there in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. But for the first time, it didn't feel daunting. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for. The recital hall bustled with energy as guests arrived for a special evening. It wasn't an event of grandeur, but a gathering of family, friends, and a few of Jihoon's close colleagues. The centerpiece of the night was an unexpected performance, a surprise Jihoon had meticulously planned. Kang Aryam stood backstage, her heart pounding as she adjusted the cuffs of her simple yet elegant black dress. Her reflection in the mirror stared back at her, equal parts nervous and curious. The spotlight wasn't something she had sought for years, and now, stepping into it felt both foreign and thrilling. Yunbi tugged at her hand, her small face glowing with excitement. You're going to play, Miss Kang. I can't wait to hear you. Aryam knelt to Yunbi's level, smoothing down the girl's dress. This isn't just about me, Yunbi. It's about all of us celebrating the music we found together. Yunbi grinned, her excitement contagious. Appa said he has a surprise for you too. Did he? Aryam asked, her curiosity piqued. Meanwhile, Jihoon stood near the entrance, greeting guests with his usual reserved demeanor. But tonight, there was a subtle shift in his presence, his shoulders less rigid, his tone softer. Seo Min-seok, his oldest friend, watched him with a knowing smile. You look less like the workaholic tyrant I know, Min-seok teased. What changed? Jihoon's lips curved into the faintest smile. Someone reminded me what really matters. Ah, Min-seok said, nodding toward the stage where Aryam was preparing. That's someone, I assume. Jihoon didn't respond, but his gaze lingered on Aryam as she adjusted the sheet music. When the time came, the audience quieted, the anticipation palpable. Jihoon stepped onto the stage first, his commanding presence silencing the last whispers of chatter. He cleared his throat, his usual cool demeanor replaced by a rare sincerity. Thank you all for being here tonight, he began. This evening is about celebrating music, resilience, and the connections that bring us back to life. And it wouldn't have been possible without someone who reminded me and my daughter of the beauty we'd forgotten. Kang Aryam. Aryam's breath caught in her throat as she stood backstage, her hands gripping the edge of the curtain. Tonight, Aryam will play a piece she composed, one that reflects not just her talent but her heart. The applause was warm and encouraging as Jihoon stepped aside, his eyes meeting Aryam's as she walked onto the stage. Aryam's hands trembled slightly as she sat at the piano, but the sight of Yunbi in the front row, clapping eagerly, steadied her nerves. Taking a deep breath, she began to play. The first notes rang out, clear and resonant, filling the hall with a melody that spoke of longing, hope, and quiet strength. Each keystroke felt like a piece of her soul being shared, the music weaving a story that words could never fully capture. As the final note lingered, the room erupted in applause. Ariam rose, bowing gracefully, her chest swelling with a mix of relief and pride. After the performance, the reception was lively, filled with laughter and conversation. Jihoon found Ariam standing near the balcony, looking out at the city lights. "You were incredible," he said, his voice warm and low. Ariam turned to him, her cheeks flushed from the praise. "I wasn't sure if I could still do it, but seeing Unbi there, it gave me the courage." Jihoon stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Yunbi isn't the only one you've given courage to." Ariam's heart skipped at the intensity of his words. Jihoon, before she could continue, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wrapped box. "I wanted to give you this," he said, handing it to her. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a delicate silver key. "It's the key to a new studio," Jihoon explained. "A place where you can teach, compose, or perform, whatever you want. It's yours." Ariam's eyes filled with tears as she held the key tightly. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll keep making music," Jihoon said, his voice soft, "and that you'll stay in our lives." Ariam looked up at him, her smile radiant. "I will." From the doorway, Yunbi watched them with a wide grin, her heart full at the sight of the two people she cared about the most standing together. The soft hum of the city at dawn was a melody in itself, a gentle reminder of the quiet moments before life resumed its bustling rhythm. In Yoo Ji-hoon's mansion, however, the air was alive with warmth and anticipation. Kang Ariam sat at the piano in the music room, her fingers dancing over the keys. She wasn't practicing, just letting her thoughts flow in the form of a simple, heartfelt melody. The early sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a golden glow across the room. "That's pretty," Yunbi's voice chimed from the doorway. Ariam turned to see the little girl, her dark eyes bright and full of life. She was holding a stack of freshly drawn sheets of music in her hands. "Good morning, Yunbi," Ariam greeted, standing to hug her. "What do you have there?" "I wrote a song," Yunbi said proudly, handing Ariam the papers. "You inspired me, so I wanted to try." Ariam scanned the pages, her heart swelling with pride. The notes were simple yet earnest, a reflection of the innocence and determination Yunbi carried. "It's beautiful," Ariam said, pulling her into a hug. "We'll play it together later, okay?" Yunbi nodded, her smile radiant. Appa said he wants to hear it too. Later that day, Jihoon joined them in the music room. He was dressed casually, a rare sight, and the usual stern lines of his face seemed softer. "Ariam told me about your song," Jihoon said, sitting beside Yunbi on the piano bench. "Will you play it for me?" Yunbi hesitated, glancing at Ariam for reassurance. "We can play it together," Ariam offered, sitting on the other side of the piano. The music they created was light and joyous, each note a testament to the bonds they had built. Jihoon listened intently, his gaze shifting between his daughter and Ariam. The sound filled the mansion, replacing its once heavy silence with something hopeful and alive. The evening found the three of them on the mansion's balcony, watching the stars emerge one by one. Yunbi sat between Jihoon and Ariam, her head resting on Ariam's shoulder. "Do you think Mom can hear my song?" Yunbi asked softly, her eyes fixed on the night sky. Jihoon's expression grew tender. "I'm sure she can, and I think she's very proud of you." Yunbi's lips curved into a small, content smile. Ariam reached for Jihoon's hand, her touch light but steady. He glanced at her, and for the first time, There was no hesitation in his gaze, only a quiet gratitude for the woman who had brought light back into his life. As the night deepened, Yunbi drifted off to sleep, her soft breaths blending with the sounds of the evening. Jihoon carried her to bed, tucking her in gently before returning to the balcony where Aryam waited. "She's incredible," Aryam said, as Jihoon joined her, her voice filled with admiration. "She gets that from you," Jihoon replied, his tone sincere. Aryam turned to him, surprised. "Jihoon." Before she could finish, he reached for her hands, holding them between his. "You've given me and Yunbi something I never thought we'd have again. A chance to heal, to feel whole. I don't know what I did to deserve it, but I don't want to lose it." Aryam's eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling as she replied, "You don't have to. I'm here, Jihoon, for both of you." The stars above seemed to shine brighter as Jihoon pulled her into a gentle embrace, the weight of their unspoken emotions finally lifted. The next morning, Aryam stood in the doorway of her new music studio, the key Jihoon had given her clutched in her hand. The space was perfect, bright, inviting, and full of possibilities. A blank canvas waiting to be filled with melodies, lessons, and memories. Jihoon arrived with Yunbi, both carrying flowers. "Your first students," Jihoon teased, a rare smile lighting up his face. Aryam laughed, shaking her head. "You're both terrible students, but I suppose I can make an exception." As they stepped into the studio together, the air was filled with laughter and the promise of a new beginning. It wasn't just a new chapter for Aryam, but for all of them, a family built not by blood, but by choice, love, and music.